Chapter 11. Longridge's hours of telephoning the night he returned had brought results, and in the following week he and the hunter spent many hours patiently tracking down evidence which was sometimes so conflicting and confusing that it was useless, and sometimes so coincidental that it was difficult to believe. Sometimes they felt wearily that every man, woman, or child who had seen a cat or dog walking along a road in the last 5 years had called to tell them so. But on the whole, everyone had been extraordinarily helpful and kind, and they had evidence of several genuine encounters. When the results had been sifted down, they bore out Longridge's original guess as to the line of travel. The dogs, nothing further had been heard of the cat, had taken an almost perfect compass course due west, and the line he had drawn on the map had been remarkably accurate. The brother of one of the bush pilot's Indian guides had met a cousin recently returned from rice harvesting who had some wild story of a cat and dog appearing out of the night and casting a spell over the rice crop so that it multiplied 1,000-fold, and the little girl called Helvi Nurmi, her voice distressed and tearful, had described in detail the beautiful Siamese cat who had stayed for so short a time with her. Somewhere in the Ironmouth Range, a forester had reported seeing 2 dogs, and a surly farmer had been overheard in Job Wood's general store on the public telephone, Phillipsville, saying that if he could lay hands on a certain white dog, ugly as Sin was, a great vicious powerful beast, who had killed a flock of prize-winning chickens and savagely beat up his poor, peace-loving collie, he would break every bone in his body. Peter had smiled for the first time on hearing this. If he had conjured up for him a vivid picture of Bodger in his aggressive element, thoroughly enjoying himself in a fight, cheerfully wicked and unrepentant as ever, he would rather have heard this than anything, for he knew that his unquenchable, wayward old clown was not made for sadness or uncertainty. His deep grief he kept to himself, and would not undermine it now with this softening hope. Bodger was dead, Luath almost certainly so, and his conviction was steady and unalterable. Elizabeth's attitude was the complete reverse of her brother's. She was completely and utterly convinced that her Teo was alive, and that sooner or later he would return. Nothing could shake her confidence, even though there had been no word of her cat since he had left the Nurmi so long ago and so many miles away. She dismissed all tactful efforts to explain the odds against his return. Some day, somehow, a penitent Siamese would reappear, and after scolding due a thoughtless truant, he would receive with pleasure and surprise his new red collar. But she was the only one who held this cheerful confidence. After the kindly James Mackenzie had telephoned with the news that both dogs had been alive 10 days ago, the family had pored over the map and seen the barrier that stretched between them and any admitted hope. Lonely, wild terrain, rugged and cruel enough to beat down the endurance of any fresh and powerful dog, let alone the sick, half-starved, exhausted one that Mackenzie had described, leader and part sight for another whose willing heart could not withstand for long the betrayal of his years. All that could be hoped for now was that the end of their journey had come quickly and mercifully in that wilderness. Longridge was visiting the hunters, and partly to get away from the depressing telephone calls from well-meaning but ill-informed people, and partly because it was Peter's 12th birthday the following Sunday, he suggested that they all go and camp out in the hunter's summer cottage on Lake Windigo. Even though it had been closed for the winter, they could take sleeping bags, using only the living room and kitchen, which would be warmed by the Quebec heater. At first there had been some qualms for Elizabeth about leaving the house in case Teo should choose that weekend to return, but Longridge showed her that Lake Windigo lay on the direct westward route that he had traced on the map, and reminded her that Teo knew the surrounding areas for miles from his many expeditions with the dogs. Elizabeth packed the red collar and seemed satisfied, too easily, he suspected, dreading her disillusionment. The cottage was full of memories, but it was easier to accustom the mind to new ones and train it to the loss in surroundings that were so different at this time of year. It was as if they were both discovering new land, a cold lake empty of boats, the few cottages nearby all blindly shuttered, locked and empty. Trails that they did not even know existed were apparent, now that the trees were bare and the undergrowth had died down. Peter had a new camera and spent hours stalking chipmunks, squirrels, and birds with it. Elizabeth spent most of her days in the precarious treehouse that they had built the previous summer, between 3 great birches on the lake shore. On the last afternoon, the Sunday of Peter's birthday, they decided to make the last expedition, taking the old Allen Trail, Lake Trail, then cutting up the face of the hill to Lookout Point and returning by the lake shore. It was an exhilarating walk through the crisp, clean air, and the leaves thick and soft along the quiet trails, and over everything the indefinable healing peace and stillness of the Northland bush. They walked for the most part in a companionable silence, each busy with his own thoughts. To Jim Hunter, a walk without a dog lacked savor, and he remembered other fall days when, gun in hand, he had walked through this same peaceful solitude, Luath ranging from side to side, the excited summons to a treed partridge, and the gentleness of his dog's mouth around the soft fallen bird. Then dawns and dusks on Manitoba marshes and lakes crowded his memory, freezing hours of patient waiting shared in canoes and blinds and stubble fields. The thought of Luath's last retrieve, as Mackenzie had described it, affected Hunter more than anything else, for he knew the frustrated humiliation his dog would feel with a pain-locked mouth and a bird to be brought in. Peter had taken a short-cut up the steep, rocky side of the hill. He sat on a log, staring into space, and he too remembered this time last year, when he had tried to train Bodger as a gun dog by throwing a stuffed leather glove into the bush after firing a BB gun. The willing cooperation and eager retriever the first day, then increasingly limp-tailed boredom and sulky ears, followed by deepening deafness, limping paws, and an unbearable air of martyrdom, and terminated 2 days running so subtly by Bodger's appearance out of the bush with a diligent, puzzled expression, but no leather glove. The corners of Peter's mouth lifted when he remembered the scene that followed, the third day's throw and shot. Then his quiet stalk after his white hope into the depth of the bush, and the wily Bodger furiously digging a third glove grave. He sighed now, in his sudden loneliness, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand, and picked up his camera, for he could hear his family coming. They sat for a long time on the far rocks of the Lookout Hill, where long ago the Indians had built their warning signal fires, looking across the endless chain of lakes and tree-covered hills to the distant blur that was the Great Lake Superior. It was very peaceful and quiet. A chickadee sang his poignant little piece for them, and the inevitable Whiskey Jack arrived on soundless wings to pick up cookie crumbs from within a few feet. Everyone was silent. Everyone was preoccupied. Suddenly, Elizabeth stood up. "Listen," she said. "Listen, Daddy, I can hear a dog barking." Complete and utter silence fell as everyone strained their ears in the direction of the hills beyond. No one heard anything. "You're imagining things," said her mother. "Or perhaps it was a fox. Come along, we must start back." Wait, just a minute. You'll be able to hear it in a minute, too," whispered Elizabeth, and her mother, remembering the child's hearing, was still young and acute enough to hear the squeaking noise of bats and other noises lost forever to adults, and now even to Peter, remained silent. Elizabeth's tense, listening expression changed to a slow, dawning smile. "It's Luath," she announced matter-of-factly. "I know his bark." "Don't do this to us, Liz," said her father gently, disbelieving. Now Peter thought he heard something too. "Shh!" There was silence again, everyone straining to hear in the agony of suspense. Nothing was heard, but Elizabeth had been so convinced, the knowledge written so plainly on her face, that now Jim Hunter experienced a queer, urgent expectancy, every nerve in his body tingling with certain awareness that something was going to happen. He rose and hurried down the narrow path to where it joined the broader track leading around the hill. "Whistle, Dad," said Peter breathlessly, behind him. The sound rang out piercing, shrill, and sweet, and almost before the echo rebounded, a joyous answering bark rang around the surrounding hills. They stood there in the quiet afternoon, their taut bodies awaiting the relief of suspense. They stood at the road's end, waiting to welcome a weary traveler who had journeyed so far, with such faith along it. They had not long to wait. Hurtling through the bushes on the high hillside of the trail, a small, black-tipped, wheaten body leaped the last 6 feet down with careless grace and landed softly at their feet. The unearthly, discordant wail of a welcoming Siamese rented the air. Elizabeth's face was radiant with joy. She kneeled and picked up the ecstatic purring cat. "Oh, Teo!" she said softly, and as she gathered him into her arms, he wound his black needle-tipped paws lovingly around her neck. "Teo," she whispered, burying her nose in his soft, thyme-scented fur, and Teo tightened his grip in such an ecstasy of love that Elizabeth nearly choked. Longridge had never thought of himself as being a particularly emotional man, but when the Labrador appeared an instant later, a gaunt, stare-coated shadow of the beautiful dog he had last seen, running as fast as his legs would carry him toward his master, all his soul shining out of sunken eyes, he felt a lump in his throat. And at the strange, inarticulate, half-strangled noises that issued from the dog when he leaped at his master, and the expression of his friend's face, He had to turn away and pretend to loosen Teo's two loving paws. Minutes passed. Everyone had burst out talking and chattering excitedly, gathered around the dog to stroke and pat and reassure, until he too threw every vestige of restraint to the winds and barked as if he would never stop, shivering violently, his eyes alight and alive once more, and never leaving his master's face. The cat on Elizabeth's shoulder joined in with the raucous howls. Everyone laughed, talked, or cried at once, and for a while there was a pandemonium in the quiet wood. Then suddenly, as though the same thought had struck them all simultaneously, there was silence. No one dared to look at Peter. He was standing aside, aimlessly, cracking a twig over and over again until it became a limp ribbon in his hands. He had not touched Luath, and turned away now when the dog at last came over, including him in the almost human round of greeting. "I'm glad he's back, Dad," was all he said. "And your old Teo cat, too," he added to Elizabeth with a difficult smile. Elizabeth, the matter-of-fact, burst into tears. Peter scratched Teo behind the ears, awkward, embarrassed. "I didn't expect anything else. I told you that. I tell you what," the boy continued with desperate cheerfulness, avoiding the eyes of his family. "You go on down. I'll catch up with you later. I want to go back to the lookout and see if I can't get a decent picture of that Whiskey Jack." "There will never be a more blurred picture of a Whiskey Jack," said Uncle John grimly to himself. On an impulse, he spoke aloud. "How about if I come too, Peter? I could throw the crumbs and perhaps bring the bird nearer." Even as he spoke, he could have bitten back the words, expecting a rebuff, but to his surprise, the boy accepted the offer. They watched the rest of the family wending their way down the trail. Teo still clutched in Elizabeth's arms, gently worshipping Luath's restored at last to the longed-for position of his master's heels. The two remaining now returned to Lookout Point. They took some photographs. They prized an odd-shaped fungus growth of a tree. They found incredibly the cylindrical core of a diamond drill. And all the time they talked. They talked of rockets, orbits, space. Gravely they pondered the 7 stomachs of a cow, tomorrow's weather, but neither mentioned dogs. Now, still talking, they were back at the fork of the trail. Longridge looked surreptitiously at his watch. It was time to go. He looked at Peter. "We'd better," he started to say, but his voice trailed off as he saw the expression on the face of his tense, still frozen boy beside him. Then followed the direction of his gaze. Down the trail, out of the darkness of the bush and into the light of the slanting bars of sunlight, jogging along with his peculiar nautical roll, came Captain Burrowcastle, Brigadier of Dawn. Burrowcastle Brigadier's ragged banner of a tail streamed out behind him. His battle-scarred ears were upright and forward, and his noble pink and black nose twitched, straining to encompass all that his short, peering gaze was denied. Thin and tired, hopeful, happy, and hungry, his remarkable face alight with expectation, the old warrior was returning from the wilderness. Bodger, beautiful for once, was coming as fast as he could. He broke into a run, faster and faster, until years fell away, and he hurled himself towards Peter, and as he had never run before, as though he would outdistance him. Peter was running toward his dog. John Longridge turned away then and left them, an undistinguishable tangle of boy and dog, in a world of their own making. He started down the trail as in a dream, his eyes unseeing. Halfway down he became aware of a small animal running at lightning speed toward him. It swerved past his legs with an agile twist, and he caught a brief glimpse of a black masked face and a long black tail before it disappeared up the trail in swiftness of a second. It was Teo, returning for his old friend, that they might end their journey together. And that is the end of The Incredible Journey by Sheila Burnford, read by your daddy. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you soon. Love you guys. Bye.